And with that, we'd like to bring in Vice President JD Vance. Mr. Vice President, thank you for being here. I want to start with where the peace deal stands. We are reportedly told that Witkoff and Kushner are expected to be in Switzerland today. You were at one point expected to possibly be there. Do you have plans? Will you go?
Yeah, so we'll plan the talks when the principals from the Iranian government, also the Qatari and the Pakistani government arrive. That may happen as soon as tomorrow, but these things are always a little bit in flux. Jared and Steve have been on the ground now for a few hours, dealing with some of the technical elements of this negotiation. As you guys know, one of the things the president has set us out to do as a high priority is to open the Straits. That's now happened. We actually got 16 million barrels of oil out of the Straits of Hormuz yesterday. That is a record going back to even before the conflict started. So you're seeing those ships move. The second thing the president has asked us to do, of course, is to get the enriched stockpile of uranium to ensure that we make it effectively impossible for the Iranians to rebuild their nuclear program, even over a very long period of time. The program is destroyed, but we're, of course, trying to take away as many of the cards where they may try to rebuild it if they don't behave under this agreement. So that's the first part of the negotiation. My understanding, talking to Jared and Steve this morning, is things are going well. But of course, we're going to verify all of this. And that's the thing that, you know, a lot of the criticisms of the deal have really underappreciated, is that the United States has all the cards. The Straits are now open. The Iranian military is now destroyed. The Iranians have committed to, of course, destroying that stockpile of enriched material, but we have a lot of economic pressure applied to the Iranians that we would be willing to relieve if they do what we need them to do. If they don't do that, of course, there's no skin off our back. They're still in a much weakened position.
So do you have any immediate plans to join Jared and Steve?
Yeah, I expect that I will leave sometime the next couple of days, but, you know, it's always a delicate coordination dance and the diplomatic protocols. I got to be honest with you, I don't really understand these things. I've never been particularly into diplomatic protocols. My attitude is, let's get on the ground and actually fix these problems. But they want to do a delicate dance. The Qataris and the Pakistanis want to make sure that we do this in the right way. So I'm trying to be respectful. Given my position of the last year and a half, I have to care about diplomatic protocols all of a sudden.
Love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, last night I had Victor Davis Hanson on, the great Victor Davis Hanson, on my. I was guest hosting for Jesse Watters Primetime, and he laid out in an op-ed, and we discussed it on the show, a lot of the misconceptions about the deal, the memorandum of understanding, and this potential peace deal with Iran. And I thought he did a really good job doing that. I agree that there are misconceptions, but is it possible, Mr. Vice President, that there's not just misconceptions about the deal, but that there are different goals between the partners? In other words, is Israel's goal regime change at all costs, and America's goal is to make sure they don't have nukes and open the Straits of Hormuz? And is that where some of the problem is? And also, are you confident that you can maintain this ceasefire enough to get you to Switzerland and get this deal signed?
So first of all, Rachel, I'm very confident we can maintain the ceasefire. And I don't know if there's a divergence of goals or sometimes just a divergence of how to accomplish those goals. I obviously don't want to speak for the Israeli government. They've been a good partner in a lot of ways. But what the President of the United States has said, you know, counter to some of the elements within their government, is that we're going to give this negotiation a chance. We're going to go after that enriched stockpile of uranium. We're going to try to reset the situation that we have so that the Iranians don't just have a destroyed nuclear program now, but so that we can say with some confidence, a combination of inspections and verification, that they're never going to be able to rebuild that program. The president, Rachel, comes back to this, as you know, because you know him so well, constantly. Iran's not going to have a nuclear weapon for the next 2.5 years. He's thinking about this for my kids' sake, for our grandkids' sake, to ensure that you never have this regime with the ability to develop a nuclear weapon. And then at the same time, the president is also offering an outstretched hand, saying that if they change their behavior fundamentally, then the United States could have a different relationship with that country. So it really is a two-step process. There's a fork in the road here. The United States wins either way, but I think that what ultimately happens from here is very much up to the Iranians. Do they want to behave better? If so, great. If they don't want to behave better, the President of the United States still has a whole lot of options from here.
So, Mr. Vice President, I certainly understand that part, but I do want to ask you about some of the criticism you're getting, to include from the Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker and others, Republicans, that have said they're concerned that the gains that the president is able to get right now in diminishing Iran's capabilities, in setting back their nuclear program, that even if they began to perform, as you said, they'll be held to account, that to give them something like $300 billion in this fund, in other ways, to economically reconstitute their regime, that at a later date, they would just go right back to doing what they've done for 47 years. Your reaction?
So my reaction, first of all, I like Roger. He's a friend of mine, but I think that he's wrong on this, because he actually misstates the sequencing of what the MOU says. What the MOU says is that if the Iranians behave over a long period of time, they could get some of the benefits of this bargain. And so, what the president has said is, for example, let's say that one of Iran's regional neighbors, not a single penny of this money is coming from the United States, but let's say down the road that one of Iran's regional neighbors wanted to build a power plant. Of course, they would need some sanctions changes from the United States in order to do that. Well, if Iran has changed their behavior, why wouldn't we want greater economic integration between them and their neighbors? And if they haven't changed their neighbor, of course, we're not going to permit or encourage that. And so I think that Roger, in some ways, has made the mistake of some of the Democrats who have criticized this, which is that they assume that Iran gets the benefits without changing their behavior. That's not in the text of the agreement. That's not in the substance of any of the conversations that we've had. And I would say, with all due respect to Senator Wicker, the President of the United States has shown that he's very willing to be tough in order to accomplish America's security objectives. He's not going to lose in this negotiation what we gained over the last year and a half of our engagement with Iran. He is going to ensure that we maximize benefits for the American people, but he's also saying we don't want to have a situation where if the Iranians are willing to change their behavior, we say no. Isn't the change of behavior exactly what we want? And if they do that, of course, we're going to change our relationship with them.
Well, recognizing that this is obviously an ongoing negotiation and we're still in sort of the delicate diplomatic dance, we haven't even really gotten to the diplomatic dance part. I do want to ask you about a question about the current state. Wall Street Journal reporting that the remnants of the Iranian Navy are actually turning ships back in the Strait of Hormuz. Is that, based on your understanding of the memo of understanding, is that a violation of the memo of understanding? If not, is that a problem? And if it is, what should be the response at this point in the negotiations if they are violating it?
So I'm skeptical of that reporting, or at least of some of the conclusions that could be drawn from it. But let me try to explain this, because it's actually quite important. So right now, the Straits of Hormuz, a 20-mile waterway that is a choke point for all this oil and gas, we know those straits have a lot of mines in them. Like I said just now, we got 16 million barrels out of the Strait of Hormuz in just the last 24 hours. That is basically to where it was before the war even started. And so that suggests that the straits really are open. Now, what I would believe is that if a ship was going near a minefield, either our Navy or somebody else's Navy, there are a lot of countries other than Iran who are in the region, might say, no, don't go there because there are mines there. And what the MOU contemplates is a 30-day period where we demine the straits, where we open up the traffic there. But no, we're not seeing any evidence that the Iranians are still closing down the Strait of Hormuz. It is going to take some time to clear those mines, though.
You know, I know you're a Christian man, JD, and in the process of this conflict, we know that things opened up in Lebanon. A conflict opened up in Lebanon between Israel and the terrorists and Hezbollah, and so many Christians have been displaced, tens of thousands of them, and thousands have lost their lives as well. Do you have a message to the Christians in Lebanon?
Well, I would just say that to those Christians in Lebanon, keep your faith in Jesus Christ and know that you have a lot of good friends in the United States government who are trying to promote peace in the region. You know, the fundamental problem for those Christians, or the reason that those Christians face such violence, is because you have Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that has effectively taken up shop in Lebanon. Sometimes they're firing at the Israelis. Of course, that means the Israelis are going to respond in self-defense. And so there's this constant slow burn of conflict. It's actually gotten a lot better, Rachel, over the last couple of weeks, thanks to the work of the president, of Secretary Rubio, and of a whole lot of others in the administration. But sometimes peace takes a little bit of time to really take root. And that's what we're working towards. And that's really what we're working towards in the entire region, is just to change the way that we've done business. It's such a beautiful region of the world. There are so many Christians, Jews, Muslims who live there. Most of them are, of course, peaceful people. There's great economic potential. If you talk to our friends in Israel and the Gulf Coast, what they're saying is that if this deal really takes root, this could transform the Middle East in a positive direction. Obviously, we have skeptics of the deal, but I think we've got to give more voice also to the people who think that Donald Trump is on the verge of accomplishing something that has never been accomplished before.
Yeah. Well, I commend you for you and the president working towards peace. It's certainly commendable, and it's a wonderful thing. So thank you for that.
Mr. Vice President, can I change gears a little bit and talk politics? Because we have been speaking this morning about the rise of socialism. We're seeing, obviously, there in Washington, D.C., we now have expected to be Mayor Janice Lewis George, who's a socialist. You've got Graham Plattner running in Maine. But then here in New York, we had Mayor Mamdani, along with Bernie Sanders, campaigning with a socialist candidate, Darlisa Chevalier, that is advocating for abolishing not only ICE, but also prisons. What do you make of the rise of socialism?
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, my genuine hope, was that the lesson the Democrats learned from the 2024 election is maybe we should stop being so crazy. And unfortunately, the lesson that Democrats seem to have learned from the 2024 election is to lean into the most radical fringes of their party. I mean, you guys know this. I was raised by patriotic, Christian, blue-collar Democrats who loved this country, but they weren't Republicans. But I feel, unfortunately, that those patriotic blue-collar Democrats, they increasingly don't have a place in that party anymore, at least among the elected senior leadership ranks. The other thing I'll say about this is I always find it interesting when socialists tell me that they really stand up for working people and they want to protect working people, but they want to abolish ICE. And so what does that mean? That means a flood of low-wage immigrants coming into this country, competing for wages against the working people, black, white, and brown, of the United States of America. You do not care about working people if you refuse to enforce the border. Stop pretending that you do.
Yeah, they love to talk about class, and they love to talk about working class. Of course, people who actually know people who work don't call them the working class. They call them, as you just did, workers, but they've never met a worker if they think that their platform is supported by them.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.